Hi, I'm here with Scott Wilson, who's an open source developer working here at the University of Bolton. And Scott's been involved in the Apache Wookiee project, which is a project that's been trying to integrate widget technology with learning platforms. And and the reason why I've asked Scott to talk to us really is to try and give us all an understanding about what open source development is about. So Scott, I don't know if you can just explain what is open source.
You start with the hardest question of all. There are various positions on what people think open source is. For example, there's the idea of the Free Software Foundation about free software, which is a very political view of what open source is all about. So it'd be like Richard Stallman. And the idea is, I think it does flow to open source, which is that the free in free for free software is really about freedom. It's not about getting software for nothing. It's about being able to do what you want with software. So free of end-use restriction, free of licensing restriction, and so on. And the FSF tends to focus on things like the GNU licensing scheme, so viral licensing.
So FSF, Free Software Foundation.
FSF, the Free Software Foundations, they're very keen that all software in the world will eventually become free. It will all be GPL'd, and every bit of code will virally infect every other bit of code to become free.
And GPL is the GNU Public License.
That's right. Now there are more moderate views on what open source is. So things like the Open Source Initiative defined a whole set of different practices and licenses by which software can be open source. So I feel like more kind of commercially pragmatic open source. It's the idea that communities can come together and contribute to, if you like, a commons of software that is then usable by everyone, whether they're large corporations, small individuals, academics or whatever. They can all participate and they can all take advantage of software that's collectively developed.
I mean, many people, I'm sure, have used open source software. I mean, I've got an audio recorder on this computer here called Audacity, which is a piece of open source software. We use an open source learning system in the university called Moodle. And so, this is becoming quite common. It's becoming, I'm sure, most of the people watching this talk between us will have used some free software.
Yes.
And it raises a question, why get involved? Why, what is there for people to do? And why, what's in it for me to get involved?
Okay, I mean, there are many different reasons why people get involved in this sort of development. A lot of large companies use open source software for their core offerings. So companies like Oracle, for example, the majority of their platform is actually open source. A lot of the systems that people will buy for large corporations basically are layers of open source software on top of which they provide some sort of value add. So a lot of companies, like IBM, actually employ their staff to work on open source projects.
So these are jobs, basically. These are people's jobs coming in to work on open source projects.
Because often as a developer, for example, say you're involved in like a company like IBM that's producing packages of software for a company, for a client, and you've got a problem, there's a bug in part of the software and it's open source, what do? Well, you fix the problem. How do you fix the problem? By engaging with the original project that developed the software. So there are a lot of people whose day job may be in commercial development, but part of that is actually to work on open source projects as well.
So what you're saying is that the skills involved in engaging with open source projects are becoming really important for people to actually gain employment in the industry, and they're very much part of what people whose working lives as technical developers or people working for technical teams in the computer industry, open source software is a fundamental part of the things that they're doing.
Absolutely. There are very few, I think, companies, certainly at the larger scale, the enterprise type scale, that aren't involved in open source. Simply because if we look at the models of innovation, that the actual effort in research and development to build an entire platform from scratch using only your own talent and only your own code, I mean, those days are really long gone. Every new software product on the market is layer upon layer upon layer of things that other people have built. And many of those things that have been built are common enough that companies that otherwise compete collaborate in open source. I mean, a classic example is something called WebKit.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
So WebKit is the fundamental kind of browser technology that you find in Google Chrome and Safari and on many mobile phones. Now, Google and Apple compete very strongly against each other, but not on WebKit. And they both collaborate in the development of WebKit and submit code back to improve WebKit, even though they offer competing browsers. So that's a clear example where even very competitive kind of organisations will still collaborate on open source.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think this is for students who are learning about the computer industry, learning how to program, trying to gain these skills. There's always a difficult stage where you realise that many of the things you're asked to do in university, which is often writing programs from scratch, you never actually do that when you start working.
No, it's very rare. I mean, what you mostly do as a practicing developer is you try and find existing solutions to your problem. And particularly when you're looking at product design or you're looking at open source, is you're very keen to see how those solutions are licensed. Can you reuse them? So one of the key tasks in an open source project is identifying where each piece of code came from, who wrote it, and how is it licensed. So it's like the legal and IP management aspect.
This is a research activity, really, isn't it? And I often find myself as a programmer, I feel as though I'm engaging in research, in trying to find out where things come from and how they're put together, and rather than actually writing code myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're working in an open source project, often what you're trying to do when you identify issues is not try and fix them, but trying to find other people to fix them for you. I mean, in terms of how the processes work, I mean, the process of open source development, certainly in an area like Apache, it very closely mirrors what goes on in proprietary software development. It's pretty much the same set of processes, very much the same set of tools you use, very much the same set of techniques. Now, that's not the example for all open source development. There are individual developers who knock out a game, release the code on SourceForge, manage it all themselves in a very kind of sort of self-managed kind of way. But for larger projects like the Apache ones, it very much is the same sort of process that you'd go through if you're developing software in Oracle or in Apple or in IBM or Microsoft.
Or to just say that, I mean, these two sort of things that we've mentioned. First of all, SourceForge is basically a repository or a giant bucket where you developers, people who are writing programs, can deposit their programs where they can be worked on collaboratively with other people. It's also a good place to get free software, actually.
Yeah, there's a lot of code in there. The difference between something like SourceForge and the Apache Software Foundation is that SourceForge is really about the code, principally. Apache is really about the community. And the key thing about open source projects, particularly in Apache, is how they are sustained and developed and maintained over time. So the key processes there are things about how we encourage people to participate, how we show appreciation for people's contributions, how we ensure those contributions can be reused particularly by large corporations who have concerns about the legal issues. So it's very much focused on how do you create a sustainable community around some code rather than just a place to dump it so that people can download it.
I mean, Apache, of course, is famous. I mean, probably some of the students watching this will be familiar with the Apache web browser.
Web server.
With the Apache web server. I don't know if that's where they started. Is that
that was the first project, and after that other things were added on. I mean, a lot of, if you like, core web server technologies are all developed and maintained at Apache.
So, I mean, this is fascinating stuff, but how would somebody who perhaps is in the early stages of their development as a computer professional, how would